All right, it's 9:30. Welcome to class. Last class before a long weekend. I hope everybody is ready. We are going to be doing two things today. The first is section 3 and 4 of Mice and Men. Then you're going to take your quiz on Of Mice and Men on sections 3 and 4. Then I'm going to send out your vocab, and we should be done for the weekend. Make sure you have all your other stuff done. That will be due, obviously, let's call it at the end of the day tomorrow. I'll start grading it all. But welcome to class. Let's get on, moving on so we can get going and have fun this long 3-day weekend. So, Mice and Men Part 3. So, evening, after dinner and working in the fields, George and Slim return to the bunkhouse and they sit together at a card table while the rest of the laborers enjoy a horseshoe game outside. George thanks Slim for giving Lenny one of the new puppies and says Lenny's probably so excited about his new pet he'll want to sleep in the barn with the litter. Slim says he's happy to give Lenny a pup and remarks how strong and hardworking Lenny is. Whereas the boss and Curly are kind of skeptical of the arrangement that George and Lenny has, Slim seems to be touched by their friendship, right? He likes Lenny, he wants him to feel welcome, and it kind of suggests that that's kind of a relationship that he wants too, right? He doesn't want it to always be he's only looking out for himself. He'd like the companionship that George and Lenny seem to share. Slim remarks how strange it is to see two men traveling and working alongside each other, and he calls Lenny a cuckoo. George remarks that he himself isn't so bright either, and that he and Lenny need each other, and explains that they were both born in Auburn, and Lenny's Aunt Clara took George in when he was a baby and raised him. After Clara died, George explains Lenny started working with George, and they got kind of used to each other. George admits that he used to play jokes and pranks on Lenny, enjoying how kind of Lenny's dim wits made him seem goddamn smart, he said. But after one of his pranks nearly resulted in Lenny's death, George resolves to never mess with him again. Well, it seems like Lenny's the one entirely dependent on George for support and survival. The passage makes it clear that George feels the same for Lenny. He's in need of Lenny just as much as Lenny is in need of him. And it's become a partnership. He protects Lenny. And Lenny also serves to protect George from his darker impulses as well. Lenny makes George be a better man. The relationship challenges some societal ideals, especially at the time, about what makes somebody weak and what makes somebody strong. George begins playing solitaire. He confesses to Slim that he doesn't want to get rid of Lenny and go around alone like most ranch workers, even though Lenny's a nuisance who often gets him in trouble. George begins telling him the story of what happened in Weed, the story of how Lenny got them run out of town after he seized the girl's soft dress, right? The girl told the police she'd been raped, and a band of local men tried to hunt Lenny down to punish him. George and Lenny hid out in an irrigation ditch until nightfall, at which point they got the heck out of there, right? George insists Lenny never would have hurt the woman, and he only wanted to feel her dress, right? He longs to pet mice and puppies and soft things, so he's got this preoccupation with it, right? It might seem odd to other people, but George kind of understands it and knows that Lenny doesn't have any of these dark desires that people place on him, even though it might look like it, right? George knows he needs to defend Lenny against people who misunderstand him and would seek to alienate, harm, or even kill him for being who he is. Lenny then comes into the bunkhouse, breathless with joy over his new puppy, lies down on his bed. George tells him he's not allowed to have the puppy in the bunkhouse. Lenny insists he doesn't have the pup, but George approaches Lenny and wrestles the puppy out of his arms. George warns Lenny that if he kills the puppy, he'll kill it if he keeps it away from its mom, and threatens to have Slim take the puppy away again if Lenny doesn't treat it right. Lenny takes the puppy back and hurries to return into the barn. Slim remarks that Lenny is just like a child, and George agrees and says that, like a child, Lenny doesn't want to do any harm. The problem is he's so strong, sometimes he can't. He doesn't understand it, right? Protecting Lenny from others isn't the extent of his duties as a friend. The passage makes it clear that George must also protect Lenny from Lenny. George knows Lenny doesn't understand his own strength. He might hurt himself or the things he loves if he doesn't help him. We saw that with Lenny drinking water. Remember, he drank so much water that he got sick the one time. We've seen him with the dead mouse, this lady's arm and weed. He doesn't understand, and it's the lack of that mental capacity that's really hurting Lenny in the long run. George tries his best to help Lenny out in that aspect, and so that's that half of that relationship. Candy finally comes into the bunkhouse with his old dog trailing in behind him. Carlson, another laborer, comes into the bunkhouse. He lost at Horseshoes outside to the black stable hand and is not very happy about it. He sniffs the air and tells Candy to get his stinking dog out of the bunkhouse, right? Candy says he's around the dog so much he doesn't notice the smell. Carlson suggests Candy put the dog out of his misery and shoot him. And if Candy aims right at the back of the head, he says the dog won't feel pain. Okay? Candy says he can never do such a thing. He's had the dog too long, and he's used to him. And then Carlson tells him that Candy's being unkind to the dog by keeping him alive. Again, Candy's inability to imagine hurting his dog in spite of the dog's own misery mirrors George's reluctance to abandon or endanger Lenny, despite the difficulties that Lenny creates for them both, right? So there's a little symbiotic relationship going on there. Slim offers to give Candy a new pup from his dog's litter if Candy shoots his dog. Candy says he's worried about hurting the dog again, and Carlson promises that if Candy lets him shoot the dog, he'll hit it right in the back of the head and make sure it feels no pain. Candy's face is tight and tense as he considers what to do. This passage foreshadows and in a way ultimately dictates what will soon happen between George and Lenny. George will have to dispatch Lenny for both their sakes, and he'll take a lesson from Carlson in the specifics of how to do it and the ethics behind it. Another neighbor named Whit comes in and brings Slim a magazine to read. There's a letter inside by Bill Tenner, a laborer who used to work on the ranch. Carlson refuses to be distracted by Whit's remembrance of Tenner and continues hounding Candy about putting his dog down. Carlson offers to shoot it with his Luger. Though Candy suggests they wait until tomorrow, Carlson insists on doing it now. After a while, Candy finally relents, lying down on his bunk and staring at the ceiling. Carlson leads the dog outside, and Slim calls after him, reminding him to take a shovel. The passage continues to parallel Candy's relationship with his dog and George's relationship with Lenny. Carlson's insistence that the deed be done now implies that while distractions may pop up or George may try to avoid dealing with Lenny, he'll eventually have to cut ties in order to survive. The room falls silent and Slim tries to make the conversation to ease the morbid mood. He talks about his mule, who's in need of some tar and a tooth, and reminds Candy that he can have any puppy he wants. Candy does not reply. George asks if anyone wants to play some euchre, and Whit says he'll play. After he sits down at the table, though, he and George simply sit in silence. So it's so quiet the men can hear the scratching beneath the floorboards, a rat. Whit orders George to shuffle and deal cards. As George does so, the men hear a single shot ring out, and everybody looks at Candy, who rolls over and faces the wall. Even though they tried to distract from the solemn mood in the bunkhouse with some noise to drown out the noise of what's happening outside, this passage shows once again there's no turning away from the truth of what has to be done in such dire circumstances. The door opens and the stable hand peeks his head in the room. Slim greets the man as Crooks and asks him what the matter is. Crooks replies that he has some tar ready for Slim's mule's foot. Slim stands up and says he'll come take care of it. Crook warns Slim that the big new guy is messing around with the puppies. George tells Slim to kick Lenny out if he's making trouble. Crooks is perhaps so worried about Lenny being in the barn because the stable is one place where Crooks, the most marginalized and unfairly treated person on the ranch, the black guy, feels in control. He doesn't want Lenny threatening his space or getting him in trouble. Although Lenny's intentions are innocent. After Slim and Crooks leave, Whit makes small talk with George about Curly's wife, remarking on how she got the eye going all the time. Whit admits that though there hasn't been any real trouble with her yet, it's clear to everyone that she can't keep away from guys, and Curly is anxious about it. George agrees that the girl sounds like trouble. Whit invites George to come with him and the other men to a whorehouse the following night, which is Saturday. He assures him it's a clean place where the prices are good and there's always fun to be had. George says he might tag along, but is planning on saving his money so him and Lenny can buy some land. Whit loves drama and women. Although George tells Whit he's trying to save money and focus on the future and ignore distractions like whorehouses and pool halls, Whit represents the temptation that threatens to derail George and Lenny's plans. Lenny and Carlson come to the bunkhouse together. Lenny goes to bed and Carlson begins cleaning his pistol. Curly busts in, asking for his wife. Whit says she hasn't come by. Curly looks around the room and asks where Slim is. George says he's at the barn, tending his mule's hoof. And then Curly blusters away. Whit says he hopes Curly won't go after Slim, but at the same time wouldn't put it past him. Whit and Carlson decide to go over to the barn to see if the two men will fight one another. Whit and Carlson are just as quick to suspicion and anger as Curly is. They want to see blood. They want to see somebody else getting beat up and scapegoated. It means that they are safe if somebody else is getting beat up, right? George asks Lenny why he came back from the barn, and Lenny says Slim told him petting the puppies too much wouldn't be good for him. George asks if Curly's wife went by the barn, and Lenny says she didn't. George again reminds Lenny to stay out of any fights he does happen to hear or witness about. George remarks how much of a trouble a tart can make, and tells Lenny that one of their old friends from grammar school, Andy Cushman, is in prison now on account of a tart. George is just as willing as other men on the ranch to make a scapegoat out of Curly's wife, rather than consider why the men on the ranch are unable to control themselves around her. It's clear that, as the only woman on the ranch, she is marginalized and judged as being promiscuous merely because she wants attention. Lenny asks George how long it'll be until they get their piece of land. George says he doesn't know. He's heard of a place, but even though it's relatively cheap, they still have a lot of saving to do. Lenny asks George to tell him about the place. George protests that he just told Lenny about it last night, but Lenny asks to hear about it again. Of course, George retells it and tells him a big story about the lush, fertile farm they're going to live on, and they'll plant alfalfa, harvest an orchard, and raise rabbits. As George goes deeper and deeper into his details, he gets lost in his own story. This is the story that we've heard several times before, and it doesn't seem as distant now, and mainly moving somewhere to be safe and distract Lenny, right? He's usually able to resist getting swept up in his own stories, but tonight he needs the fantasy just as much as Lenny does. Lenny continues focusing on the fantasy of raising and petting as many rabbits as he wants. Both Lenny and George are so lost that when Candy speaks up, they both jump. Candy asks if there's really a place like the one George is describing, and George says there is, and that it could be his for $600. Candy states he has $300 saved up from the accident that took his hand, and would be happy to go in with George and Lenny on the property. In exchange, he says, he'd cook 10 chickens and work in the garden. George and Lenny have been alone in their fantasy for so long that when a third person says, "Oh, that sounds great, I want in," it kind of, they don't know what to do, right? It's destabilizing. It makes the fantasy a little bit more real, which is just as frightening as it is motivating and exciting. When you build something up in your mind, like they have this piece of land and what they're going to do on it, the closer it gets, the kind of scarier it becomes that it's actually going to come true. Now it's more of an investment, because like Candy is willing to go in on it as well. And it seems like it's going to force George to make these concrete plans rather than just dream about it in their head. Of course, they're a little skeptical of Candy's offer, and he says he's always conceived of himself and Lenny working the farm on their own. But as he begins doing the math, he realizes that he and Lenny will be able to get the place sooner if Candy hops in with them. And George becomes a little excited and emotional. He continues daydreaming aloud, lost in thoughts of being able to master his own destiny and do whatever he wants, right? The other men's voices can be heard approaching, and George asks Lenny and Candy to keep their plans secret. Candy agrees and solemnly remarks that he should have been the one to shoot his own dog. George has perhaps never really let himself believe the farm was something that he could achieve. It was just something to strive for, right? But now with Candy on their side, it seems like it could be more of a reality. And he takes his dream a little bit more seriously for the first time. In spite of their excitement, Candy remains disturbed to about what happened to his dog. It's kind of foreshadowing George and Lenny will still have to face unpleasantness and strife even in the face of this new lease on life. Slim, Curly, Carlson, and Whit all enter the bunkhouse. Slim and Curly are arguing. Slim says he's sick of Curly constantly asking him about his wife's whereabouts. Carlson urges Curly to get control of his wife before he has trouble on his hands. Curly threatens to fight Carlson, but Carlson accuses Curly of being yella. As tensions between the three men escalate, George realizes with horror that Lenny is smiling and laughing, still lost in thoughts of their little plot of land. Curly notices and challenges Lenny to a fight. As Curly begins hitting Lenny, Lenny keeps his hands at his side, paralyzed with fear and unwilling to defend himself. Even when somebody's beating him up and he's provoked, Lenny refuses to fight. He's the opposite of Curly in every way, but most notably, his temperament, right? Lenny's kicked back and happy-go-lucky, and Curly is just wound tight as a spring. But this gentle demeanor, the fear of trouble, the childlike mindset, means that he tries to avoid violence at any cost. Curly, on the other hand, has no problem victimizing and scapegoating Lenny in order to release his own frustrations. He doesn't want to fight Slim or Carlson because he doesn't know if he'll win, but he sees Lenny as the big dummy, and he feels that it's an easy win, so he's going to go pick on Lenny, right? He picks on the weak one, and he mistakenly thinks that Lenny is the weak one. George, angered by Curly's attack on Lenny, urges Lenny to fight back. He tells him, fight back. As Curly reaches a fist back and swings at Lenny, Lenny catches Curly's fist in one of his hands and begins crushing it. Curly starts crying in pain, but Lenny doesn't let go until George tells him to. Slim and Carlson stand over Curly and remark that they need to get him to a doctor. It hardly looks like he has a single bone left in his hand intact. Lenny cries, stating he didn't want to hurt him. Slim urges Curly to tell the boss, when asked what happened to his hand, that he got it caught in a machine. Slim warns Curly that there'll be consequences if he tells the truth, and Curly promises he won't try to get Lenny or George fired. This shows that even though in spite of Lenny's reluctance to use it, he has immense physical strength. When he focuses on something, he becomes powerful and even dangerous. Even in the face of this realization, the other men remain on Lenny's side and threaten Curly with further pain and retaliation if he tries to make things worse for poor Lenny. Carlson takes Curly away to go to the doctor in town. George tells Lenny to wash his bloody face. Lenny asks George if he's in trouble and whether he's still allowed to tend the rabbits. George assures Lenny that he's done nothing wrong. This passage shows how truly reluctant Lenny is to resort to violence of any kind because he doesn't want to upset George. In fact, it isn't until George tells him to fight back that he does. It's also revealing that he's honestly probably too strong and powerful to gently tend rabbits, but obviously that doesn't come up here. That is the end of part 3. All right, part 4 right here, vocabulary. There we go. Part 4, a little bit shorter. So, Crooks, the stable hand, doesn't sleep in the bunkhouse with the other laborers. Instead, he has a bunk in the harness room, a little shed off the wall in the barn. His room is both sleeping quarters and workshop, and he makes his bed on the straw-covered floor. Crooks has more possessions than the other men. He owns books that reflect a wide range of interests, many pairs of shoes, and medicines for both himself and the horses. Crooks keeps his room neat and never has visitors. And while he's physically isolated, he's also socially and emotionally isolated as well. He's not welcome among the fellow laborers because he's black, and he's forced to live a solitary existence, segregated from the rest of the workers. It's clear that even though he does equal work, he's not treated equally, and he's excluded from it. When they dream of a better life, the other ranchers, Crooks kind of knows because he's black, he's going to be excluded. On Saturday night, Crooks sits on his bunk alone, rubbing liniment into his sore back, and Lenny appears in the doorway and looks in on him. Though Lenny smiles amiably, Crooks warns Lenny not to come into his room. Lenny says he simply came to visit his puppy and wanted to say hello to Crooks when he saw the man's light on. Crooks says that just as he isn't wanted in the bunkhouse, Lenny isn't wanted in his room. Lenny asks Crooks why he isn't wanted, and Crooks replies he isn't wanted because he's black. Lenny doesn't understand any of this, right? He doesn't understand societal conventions. He doesn't understand why they treat Crooks differently because he's black. He doesn't. He just saw his light on and wants to say hi. Like, Lenny doesn't see any of that. Lenny says he's all alone and wants company, and everyone else except Candy's gone into town. And Candy only wants to sit in his bunk and dream about this place, right? Crooks tells Lenny to go visit his puppy if he wants, warning him to stay out of places he isn't wanted. Lenny says he already looked at his puppy and is afraid to pet it too much. Crooks softens a little and agrees to let Lenny come in and sit with him a while. Lenny thanks Crooks for letting him come in. Crooks is reluctant to open to Lenny, but after he sees how really ignorant the man is, not to mention how lonely, Crooks decides, yeah, okay, come on. Come sit with me. He recognizes Lenny, like Crooks himself, is a little disabled and looked down upon, and there's a little bit of a connection and some sympathy from Crooks to Lenny. Crooks begins telling Lenny about his past, that he grew up in California, his family was the only black family for miles around, and now Crooks feels similarly isolated. He's the only black man on the ranch, and no one listens to him, takes him seriously, or respects him because of his race. Lenny, having seemingly absorbed nothing from the story, asks how long it'll be before the puppies are old enough to pet. Crooks kind of just looks at Lenny like, wow, okay, I just told you a whole bunch and you didn't understand any of it. And he didn't really remember any of it either. And remarks that other men too, men just talk at one another without listening. So when Crooks opens up to Lenny, believing that perhaps there's a shot of friendship, Lenny was just like, puppy? What about my puppy? He's a little disappointed when Lenny can't grasp any of what he's telling him. Crooks asked Lenny what he'd do if George never came back from town. Lenny insists George wouldn't leave him, but at the same time begins to think that Crooks is right and George has abandoned him on the ranch. Crooks continues to mess with Lenny, coming up with different hypothetical reasons why George may never return. And Lenny asks Crooks, what are you doing? Like, why are you doing that? He's trying to show Lenny what life without George, or without George, Lenny couldn't do anything. That they'd tie him up in a collar, and Lenny gets really upset and a little mad and asks where George is. And Crooks assures Lenny that George will be home soon. Okay, so Lenny is unable to understand that Crooks is trying to get Lenny to see things from a different perspective, right? He can't. He becomes confused and really upset when Crooks suggests that George would abandon him, right? He doesn't understand what's going on. And as Crooks goes into more hypotheticals, like Lenny, this just shows Lenny is how desperate Lenny is, and he needs George to be with him. And he kind of understands that on a base level. Lenny does. He can't articulate it, and he knows that George would never leave him, but it doesn't prevent him from getting upset all the same. Finally, when Lenny calms down, Crook urges Lenny to see things from a new point of view. He's alone all the time because he's not allowed to spend time with the white laborers, right? A guy goes nuts if he ain't got nobody, Crook says. Lenny tells Lenny once again that he didn't mean to scare him. He was just trying to talk about his own situation. And Crooks continues to talk about his loneliness and wishing he had somebody to talk and draw comfort the way Lenny and George had. So it's a little bit of jealousy, right? That Crooks doesn't have anybody, and this big dummy has somebody to look out for him, and he is just kind of longing for that. There's more reminiscing, but Lenny finally spiels about 10 chickens and rabbits, and they talk about the farm. Crooks calls Lenny nuts and tells him every laborer who passes through the ranch has a little piece of land in his head, but never a goddamn one of them ever gets it. Crooks is frustrated with Lenny's inability to understand him, and maybe a little mad that Lenny gets to at least maintain faith in his dreams, right? Because Crooks' dreams were crushed a long time ago. Lenny isn't smart enough to realize his dreams may never happen, so I think Crooks is a little jealous of that. Let's see. Horse whinnies, and Crooks calls out to ask if Slim is coming to the barn. Candy answers him, saying he come looking for Lenny. Crooks tells Candy that Lenny's with him. Candy comes to the doorway, but makes no attempt to come inside. Like, he knows the rules, right? Crooks invites Candy in, stating that if Lenny's come by, Candy might as well come in too. And as he enters, he remarks that though he and Crooks have both been at the ranch a long time, this is the first time he's ever been in Crooks' room. In spite of his rough exterior, Crooks kind of seems happy that people are coming by. He was reluctant to let Lenny in, but now welcomes Candy in relatively warmly. Crooks is perhaps beginning to believe that maybe friendship of some kind could be possible for him. And then yet another one of the broken plans of this novella are soon going to unravel. Candy tells Lenny he's been doing some figuring and found a way for them to turn a profit on the rabbits once they move into their farm. Crooks interrupts Candy to tell him that he and Lenny are kidding themselves. He predicts they'll never get any land, and that Candy will work on the ranch until he's carried out in a box, and that Lenny will have moved on in a couple weeks' time. Candy insists that he, George, and Lenny are going to work hard and get their land, but Crooks points out that George is at a whorehouse as they speak, wasting his money. Crooks' weariness and cynicism make him the voice of reason in the story. He's the first person who told Lenny that the dream of his farm is an impossibility, and although Candy tries to push back against Crooks, it's clear that Crooks is the only one of the three of them who's able to face reality due to his experiences and disappointment. The distinction raises an interesting ethical dilemma of whether there's more compassionate to allow someone to hold on to their fantasies, or to be brutally honest and tell them about how unrealistic their plans might be. Candy said he spent his whole life working other people's land and harvesting other people's crops, and is determined to finally work on his own. Crooks seems touched by Candy's resolve and offers to lend a hand to the three of them if they should ever realize their dream. Just as Candy was moved by Lenny and George's fantasies, Crooks is moved by Candy's desire to make something of himself and control his own destiny. Crooks wants those things too, and for the first time in a long time is kind of allowing himself to believe it might be possible to him. A voice at the door startles them. Of course, it's Curly's wife, asking if any of them have seen Curly. Candy says they haven't seen him, but Curly's wife doesn't move from the door. She says she knows where all the men have gone. And Candy, looking at the ground, asks why Curly's wife is asking if she already knows where he is. She remarks, all the men on the ranch will only talk to her one-to-one. They're so scared of one another. And someone else getting dirt on them, they won't talk to her in front of one another. The passage makes it really clear that Curly's wife is never really trying to discern her husband's whereabouts at all. She doesn't care where he's at. She just comes around the bunkhouse looking for him. She's just trying to seek out company. Crooks urges Curly's wife to go back to the house, tells her they don't want any trouble. Curly's wife says she doesn't want any trouble either. She just wants someone to talk to. She's sick of Curly and his ridiculous bravado. She says she asked the men to tell her what really happened to Curly's hand, but Candy insists Curly simply got caught in the machine. Curly's wife is kind of complaining about her horrible circumstances. She would have had a career in the movies if she wanted to. And yeah. Curly's wife is onto the lies and deception of everybody around her, and she's sick of being in the middle of it, and she hates the direction her life has taken. That's basically what that goes. Curly's wife looks at Lenny's battered face and asks him where he got his bruises. Lenny is staring into his lap. He got his hand caught in a machine, is what he says. And Curly's wife continues messing with Lenny, prompting Crooks to just order her out. Curly's wife turns on Crooks, telling him that if he talks coarsely to her once more, she'll have him strung up on a tree. Candy warns Curly's wife that if she does anything that gets Crooks hurt, they'll tell on her for framing him. And Curly's wife tells Candy nobody would listen. Steinbeck established the ranch as like every man out for himself, right? So Curly's wife is the only woman, a minority, and a marginalized individual. But even so, she's white. And she is being able to basically threaten Crooks by the fact that she's white and he's black, and everybody's going to believe her. Even though she's probably one of the weakest people on the ranch, she will take advantage of any opportunity to make sure that she's not the lowest in the ranch's pecking order. So she'll turn on anybody. Candy tells Curly's wife that the men will be back soon and urges her to get up to the house before her husband catches her in the barn. Before leaving, she looks at Lenny and thanks him for busting up Curly a little bit. She resents her husband, it's obvious, right? He took her from where she was at to this place, and she's isolated from everybody and has nobody really to talk to, because every time she does, Curly gets upset. She can't do anything to retaliate against Curly, but the others can, and maybe that's what she's been trying to provoke all along. Let's keep going, a couple more. So, Crooks, clearly shaken by Curly's wife, tells Lenny and Candy that they should go. Candy tries to confront him, but he's like, yep, nope, what she said is true. A voice in the barn calls out for Lenny. It's George. He's finally back. George appears in the doorway. He chides Lenny for bothering Crooks, but Crooks insists he doesn't mind Lenny visiting. See, it goes from him not wanting to be bothered to now he doesn't mind if Lenny comes by. Candy excitedly begins telling George about the rabbits and how he figured how to make a profit. George reminds Candy that he was supposed to keep the venture a secret. Candy retorts he only told Crooks. George tells Lenny it's time to return to the bunkhouse as the two of them leave. So when Candy assures George that he only told Crooks about their plan, it implies that Crooks doesn't really count as a person, right? Candy wanted to defend Crooks against Curly's wife and comfort him in a moment of fear and pain, but still has trouble seeing him as a full complex human being. It's obvious by his comment. As Candy stands up to go back to the bunkhouse too, Crook asks him to stay back a minute. Crooks tells Candy that he wasn't serious about lending them a hand on their land. He says he wants to stay where he is. Candy bids Crooks good night and leaves, and Crooks reaches for his liniment bottle and rubs medicine into his back. Crooks knows it's too dangerous for a disabled black man to participate in the dreams of the people around him. He resigns himself once again to loneliness and insisting he didn't really want to be a part of something in the first place, right? All right, that is 3 and 4. I'm going to throw links to the quiz for 3 and 4 in the team's conversation. I'm going to do that right as soon as we end this. Same rules as before. You get to take it twice. Once you have taken it twice, I will record it. Guys, it needs to be done by today. I'm setting the deadline for tonight. Make sure that it is done so I can get it recorded. If you have any questions, stay back in here. If not, look for those links. I will be dropping them within about a minute or two. And make sure you get that vocab done too. And that's it. Have a great day and get those quizzes done.